Well, earlier we read the story of Mary and Martha. And may I ask, have you heard of the story of Mary and Martha before, somewhere along the line? Yeah? Okay. May I also ask, have you ever heard a sermon on Mary and Martha before? Yeah. And have you ever heard a sermon along the lines of, there's the Mary type Christian who's spiritual, and the Martha type Christian who's the more practical one? Anyone ever heard a sermon like that before? Yeah. Well, I'm going to be honest with you, there aren't two types of Christians, there's only one, and I do not go with that interpretation of this passage, as we'll soon see. I like this passage, and I like it because it's so very human. Can you imagine the moment in the house? Martha is running around like a headless chicken. Ever done that? Yeah. Well, they won't be doing that because the head's cut off, I suppose, yeah? But the point is, she's running around crazily, just like we were doing over Christmas, all right? But she had opened her home to Jesus, verse 38, which is a wonderful thing in itself. But even so, Martha is busy. She's doing, over and over again. And actually, you can't really blame the lady because, according to her social custom, the hospitality of the day meant she was required to open her home. She was required to honour her guest. That's what she was supposed to be doing. It was the done thing. And of course, if you got Jesus there in your very living room, well, I guess you're going to try and do a little bit of extra, aren't you, to honour him even further. And let's not forget, only one chapter before, in 10 verse 7 to 8, hospitality is viewed very highly by Jesus at that point. So she's doing what she's doing. So this is what Martha did, what she'd always done. This is what she did. Always busy, always doing. But on this occasion, this particular occasion, she was so busy, verse 40 makes it clear, she was distracted by it. And that word distracted, I really like it. It literally means this. She was pulled about in many directions. I suppose there you are, I'm doing that. I'm thinking of the strong man holding on to those columns, yeah? Pulled about in many directions, pulled apart, dragged about, dragged around. She was so busy, it's like a bit of her was in the kitchen, a bit of her was in the lounge, a bit of her was in the garden shed, and a bit of her was probably on the roof somewhere. I know they didn't have sheds in those days, but you get the point. She's absolutely dragged all over the place. And to make matters worse, can you believe it? Mary is just sitting there. I know there are times in your house when you have said, why don't you get up and do something? I'm doing everything here. Anyone ever said anything like that? Oh, yeah. So she's sitting there at the feet of Jesus, verse 39b. You can almost imagine Martha with her hand on her hip, can't you? Going something like that. Typical, isn't it? I've got the world's most important guest in my house, and my silly, lazy sister Mary, she's just sitting there doing nothing. Pull your finger out, will you? And she's so irritated, so anxious, worried and upset is Martha, verse 41, that she even, can you believe it, tells Jesus to tell Mary what to do. Tell her, Lord, to help out. Can you imagine that? Bit of a cheek, isn't it? So what's going on here? What is going on? What are we supposed to learn from this? There's two direct contrasts in this passage. First, the Martha approach. The Martha approach, for me, is performance and perfection for Christ. She performs a service for Christ. She works for Christ. She expects others to do something to help Christ. She wants to make something happen for him. She gets busy for the Lord to the point of distraction, running everything like clockwork, smoothly. So clockwork-like you can't even hear it tick. She's got it so right. And despite opening her home to Jesus, guess what? She only notices him there in passing because she's so busy. And she even tells Jesus what to do. She must fulfill her duty, even if relationships suffer, and simply Martha has focused on what is secondary. But here's Mary. And here's the contrast, the Mary approach. Mary's home has been open to Jesus, but Mary, unlike Martha, is consumed with Jesus. All she notices is Jesus, never in passing like a sister. Mary thus enters into Christ's presence. To use a phrase, something that gave me a minute, someone gave me the word, linger a minute, a few moments ago. She lingered in the Lord, lingered before the Lord. She sits at his feet as Jews would sit before their rabbi, and she listens to him. Why? Because she absolutely knows he speaks the word of God. He does. So this is a visitation of God before her. That's what Mary's thinking. And what happens? She wants Jesus to tell her what to do, not the other way around. And in that place, she experiences Jesus' unconditional acceptance of her. She experiences his freedom, and she experiences his love. And you know what I think also? This is being to being. She opens up her being to his being. She looks up at him. She's only aware of Jesus. And here's the extraordinary thing. Last Sunday, I stood here doing our family service, and one of the things I said at the beginning of the service was about, because last week was all about fixing our eyes on Jesus, walking by faith and not by sight. And at the beginning, when I was leading service, I said we need to gaze on Jesus, fix our eyes on Jesus. And at the very end of the service, Joy came up and she felt she got a word, and she said, I think we need to gaze upon Jesus. And she said, and we need to look in the fullness of his face, not just part of it. That's what she said. Guess what? What's Mary doing? This passage this week, unbeknownst to any of us, she's sitting there full-faced to Jesus. And he's full-faced back to her. No part of her face is missing from him, and no part of his is from her. Isn't that amazing? 2 weeks in a row. Maybe the Lord's saying something. Eye to eye, being to being. See, this is not just the openness of her home. This is the openness of her heart. And she totally trusts him. Totally trusts him for everything with her life. And here's an interesting little thing I thought of. Mary and Martha lived in the village of Bethany. Now, we have a young lady who attends this service called Bethany, okay? One meaning of the name Bethany is the Lord is gracious, but the other meaning, which is probably the one the family didn't use, Bethany can mean house of the poor. So what I thought was this: Mary is so unlike the meaning of the name of her village. She's not poor in this moment. She is actually spiritually rich and enriched because she's sitting with Jesus, with him, one-to-one, before him. That's what she's doing. So Mary focuses not on what is secondary, but on who, on the primary, on Jesus himself. And she chose what is better, and Jesus will not be taken from her, verse 42. I want to say today, Aldwick Baptist Church, that our mandate, if it's loving God, loving each other and loving lost people, as we think about loving God today, I think this is how we first begin. It would be so easy for me to say, love the Lord your God with all our heart, mind, soul and strength, and I'll get to that a bit later on. But you know something, that sounds awfully like a lot of doing to me. Do this, do that, do this, serve with his strength and all this, all important. But I think it starts first with an absolute sitting before God and loving God for who God is. To love him, to want him, to so trust him with anything and everything he might do and anything and everything he might say. To make him the primary person in our lives. That's what I think Jesus wants from us. So really there isn't two types of Christian, there's only one. There's the one where the person will sit before the Lord and spend real time with him, first and foremost. If I were to ask you, if I said to you the word culture, you'd know what I meant by culture. It's actually quite a complicated word to explain, isn't it? The word culture. It's a complex word. Someone defined it as the ideas, traditions, customs and social behaviour of a group of people, or a particular group of people in society or society itself. I'm going to say this morning. I think church has its culture. What do you think? Think church has got its own culture? I think it has. I think we have our own culture here. I want to say this today. I think we need a Jesus culture. And by that, I'm not referring to any Bethel music band or anything like that. I'm saying we need a Jesus culture because I want Jesus to be my everything. I want Jesus to define the church. I want Jesus to define my social behaviour. I want Jesus to define every single thing that I do and what I'm about, for him to be my way of life. And if we're concerned about the idea of sitting at Jesus' feet like Mary, because you know what happens when we talk about sitting at Jesus' feet like Mary, someone will say, oh, we won't get anything done then. Anyone ever thought that before? You know, sit at Jesus' feet, look like this meditative laziness where we don't do anything. Let me assure you, those who have encountered the real Jesus will find themselves being very busy for God, doing all sorts of things for God. But the difference is this, that actually their busyness has come from what God has first told them to do, rather than the other way round. You see, really, it's something that's fueled from the Saviour rather from ourselves. So our life for Jesus should not come from a duty, but a desire. Faith gives way to works. It's a resting in the work, not a resting from the work. It's our beings first, then the doings. You see, Martha's problem was not so much what she was doing, but how she was doing it. So, I think we need God's Spirit to be at work in us, from which everything then flows. You see, I think that when we start to spend time with Jesus in a really special way, I think he'll start to talk to us, and we will start to hear him, and we'll start to listen. I think he will make us aware of whether we're really using our time for him or for ourselves. I think he'll speak to us about our money, about our finances. I think he'll speak to us about our relationships, our behaviour, our priorities, about how we serve here. When we spend time with Jesus and we love him, he will show us grace, he will show us mercy, he will bless us, and he will lead us into what he wants us to do. And when we do that, he will give us exactly the strength we need and the grace we need for doing all that he wants us to do, because it was sourced from him. Do you know, I think one of the big questions is this. Mary totally trusted Jesus in every possible way with the whole of her life. And I think that's the question for us. Do we totally trust Jesus with every single bit of our lives? Because if we do, then what he gives us to do, what he shares with us and asks us to do, we will then be able to go and do it to the glory of his name. You see, for me, the Lord wants everything I am. He wants all that I am, every bit of me. Loving the Lord your God with all your hearts and minds and souls and strength is what God requires of us. But I think it comes from that place of first being with him and recognising who he is, and then having received, we then go and do everything we can through his strength for what he's got for us to do. See, love is the dynamic in that verse, not law. It's love that drives. Love on the vertical between us and God to us, so that we then love on the horizontal. It starts with the relationship with God. And next week I'll be looking at what does it mean to love each other. That's the horizontal stuff. But we need the vertical relationship with God first and foremost. So I think we have a vision. And I'll be honest, it challenges the socks off me. Because really, to love God, love other people and love lost people is a major ask. But I'm going to say this to us. What else are we supposed to do? This has got to be the foundational thing. And it seems to me that if we can do these things, then we will find a real change in amongst us as a people and in the world outside in the coming days and weeks. You see, I think church visions can be very complicated affairs. I was at a church the other week doing a funeral. It's a very big and very successful church, you could say. And on their wall, they had this vision statement. And I'll be honest with you, it was a great statement, but I suspect that anybody outside the leadership team probably couldn't remember all of it because it was so long. Yeah? And loving God, loving each other, loving lost people. So simple, but deeply profound. And I think it's something we need to do. I think also loving God, loving each other, loving lost people is actually very clear. I think one of the things that visions need to do is to give clarity to the people who are listening, the people involved with it. Because if there's no clarity, then it gets confusing and we don't know where we're going. And where there's clarity, it becomes obvious and full of God-led potential. I think visions will involve future planning, and we may well get to that in due course. But visions are always meant to answer one base fundamental thing. What does this vision mean for me on Monday morning? Monday morning, tomorrow, we spend time loving our God. That's the first thing we do. We love our God. We sit with him, we spend time with him, and we love him and let him love us, from which then everything else comes. You see, if we do this, there will be movement. There will be motion. You see, because honestly, and I've said this before, this, what we do on a Sunday here, is just what we do on a Sunday here. This is about discipleship. It's about a life lived for God. And where there's movement, we will never stagnate. We will never get congested. And I'll be honest with you, I've been in church a long, long time. Perhaps not as long as some of you, but I've been in church a long time. And it's very easy, I think, to get into the status quo. This is what we do. But there's a big challenge for us here. Maybe even a test for us as a church about what God is saying to us at this time. But individually, in our ministries, as we are gathered here on Sundays, I say, let us love Jesus Christ and let us keep loving him. And may God speak to us and lead us as a consequence into wonderful things this year. Amen. Thank you for listening to me.